Hey everybody, welcome to episode 10 of A Bitter Pill, the show where we offer up bitter pills of truth that way too many people don't want to swallow and that the corporate media doesn't want people to know exist. I'm doing this episode from my car because I'm at the laundromat. My girlfriend's daughter-in-law is going into labor, and so we're getting ready to go out of town, so you're doing laundry. But anyway, uh, we're in the middle, close to the end of a series comparing Democratic presidential candidates, Tulsi Gabbard and Bernie Sanders. So in this episode, I'm going to compare the foreign policies of the two candidates. And spoiler alert here, overall, I think Tulsi wins hands down on foreign policy. Both candidates' views and record are significantly better than the mainstream of the Democratic Party, however, but Bernie's views and his record put him within the liberal mainstream of the Democratic Party that buys into the premise that the U.S. is sometimes a force for good in the world that intervenes abroad for humanitarian reasons at times. Whereas Tulsi generally rejects that view, arguing that U.S. intervention abroad almost always makes things worse, irrespective of stated motives or intentions, which are typically lies, of course. So I'd like to start by looking through an interview, which you see on the screen here, with Bernie Sanders, recent interview, and that's not a recent picture, obviously, that provides what seems to be his overall perspective on U.S. foreign policy. And overall, it seems to be a relatively anti-interventionist perspective. Well, definitely is that he's sharing here. So I'm going to talk after I go through this about the extent to which his record reflects that perspective. And for now, let's look at what he says here. And this was an interview that he gave with a reporter from the New York Times in response to an article criticizing him for his support for the Nicaraguan government and his opposition to U.S. intervention in Central America during the 1980s. Okay, so let's take a look here. So in the article that he asked for an interview to respond to, the New York Times detailed Bernie Sanders' foreign policy views when he was mayor of Burlington, Vermont, including his relatively favorable view of the Sandinista government in Nicaragua that came to power in 1979 by overthrowing U.S.-backed dictator Anastasio Somoza, and his foreign policy views on the Soviet Union. And they talked about how his activities at the time brought into relief the fervently anti-imperialist worldview that would continue to guide him. So after the article was published, Bernie requested a phone interview. So to start with, he said, "Let me just say this. I plead guilty to, throughout my adult life, doing everything that I can to prevent war and destruction. As a young person, long before I held any position, I was active in opposition to the war in Vietnam. As a mayor, I did my best to stop American foreign policy, which for many years was overthrowing governments in Latin America and installing puppet regimes. I did everything that I could as a mayor of a small city to stop the United States from getting involved in another war in Central America, trying to overthrow a government." And he points out that he also helped lead the opposition to the war in Iraq, that started in 2003, vote on it in 2002. I voted against the first war back in the early 90s, he says, and I voted against the second war. And I've done everything I can to try to get the United States out of Yemen, where the U.S. is, along with Saudi Arabia, involved in a horrific, really almost genocidal war there in Yemen. So I've done everything I can to try to get the United States out of Yemen in a war that is causing unbelievable destruction in that country, and I will do everything I can to see us not getting involved in a war in Iran. That is my view, and I make no apologies for it. Sorry, I don't think I had to re-highlight this article, and I think I missed some things. So the reporter says, at the top of our story, we talked about the rally you attended in Managua, Nicaragua, and a Wire reporter at the time said that there were anti-American chants from the crowd. So she's trying to get him here, and by saying he was, at a rally where there were anti-American chants, and he didn't object to it and leave, so he must be anti-American. So Bernie responds, the United States at the time, I don't know how much you know about this, because she's kind of young, so she may not have even been alive then, or very little anyway, was actively supporting the Contras to overthrow the government. So there's anti-American sentiment. I remember that. I remember that very clearly. That there was, obviously, because the United States was trying to overthrow the government that came to power in 1979 through a revolution, and that in 1984 the people there in Nicaragua democratically elected. But the U.S. is trying to overthrow their chosen government. You do recall hearing those chants. I think the Wire report has them saying, here, there, everywhere, the Yankee will die. And there's actually I was in Nicaragua in the mid '80s briefly as well, and indeed, you could hear chants sometimes. Aquí el Yankee morirá. Here and there, the Yankee will die, because the United States has had its boot on the neck of Nicaragua and many other countries throughout Latin America for over a century. So Bernie says they were fighting against American. Yes, what is your point? Are you shocked to learn that there was anti-American sentiment? My point was I wanted to know if you had heard that, she said. I don't remember, no. Of course there was anti-American sentiment there. This was a war being funded by the United States against the people of Nicaragua. People were being killed in that war. The reporter said, do you think if you had heard that directly you would have stayed at the rally? And he said, I think, Sidney, with all due respect, you don't understand a word that I'm saying. So... Let's see. Sorry, I thought I had re-highlighted this. Here we go. Do you believe that you had an accurate view of President Ortega at the time? I'm wondering if you're... and he cut her off and said this was not about Ortega, Daniel Ortega, the elected president of Nicaragua at the time. And he is, again, now actually. Do you understand? I don't know if you do or not. Do you know that the United States overthrew the government of Chile way back? That was in 1973. Do you happen to know that? Do you? I'm asking you a simple question. And she doesn't answer him and says, what point do you want to make? My point is that fascism developed in Chile as a result of that. The United States overthrew the government of Guatemala in 1954, a democratically elected government. Overthrew the government of Brazil in 1964, another democratically elected government. I strongly oppose U.S. policy which overthrows governments, especially democratically elected governments, around the world. So this issue is not so much Nicaragua or the government of Nicaragua. The issue was, should the United States continue a policy of overthrowing governments in Latin America and Central America? I believed then that it was wrong, and I believe today it is wrong. That's why I do not believe the United States should overthrow the government of Venezuela. And this interview was conducted May 18th of last year, so it was shortly after the U.S. was actively involved in attempts to overthrow the Venezuelan government. Later she says, is there anything you believed about Latin America or the Soviet Union in the 1980s that you no longer believe today? He said, no, the Soviet Union was an authoritarian dictatorship, and that's what I believed then, and that's what I believe to be the case to be today. That's what they were. On the other hand, I was going to do everything that I could to prevent a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Let's see, anything else I need to... do you think your view on foreign policy and how to conduct it separates you from other Democrats? He said, well, I believe the United States is the wealthiest and most powerful nation on earth. So I believe, and don't hear me to say otherwise, that the United States must play a leading role in the world on international affairs. But I don't believe that we should go about overthrowing governments, and I don't believe that we should be engaged in endless wars. But the United States has the capacity to, with its wealth and with its military powerful, do everything possible to support democracy and human rights and peaceful resolutions to international conflict. If that separates me from other Democratic candidates, so be it. Pretty strong statement there. A very different perspective that you hear in this interview from Bernie Sanders and what you hear from run-of-the-mill Democratic politicians these days. There's a recognition there that the U.S. government's foreign policy has often involved illegal regime change operations, either covert operations aimed at overthrowing foreign governments, such as those in Nicaragua, Chile, Brazil, and Guatemala that Bernie mentions, or U.S. military operations with that aim, such as those in Vietnam and Iraq. And that those policies have been aimed at making those countries subservient to the U.S., rather than being undertaken with any consideration of the interests of the people in those other countries. Or at least that's the perspective that Bernie seems to be hinting at here. Obviously, it's not the mainstream perspective of people in the U.S. government. Now, we can certainly question how consistent he is in these views, as we will here shortly, and question how deep his understanding is of foreign policy, and how well the views expressed in this interview are reflected in his voting record. He's inconsistent in his record on foreign policy, as I've already suggested. But clearly, he's not just a garden variety Democrat when it comes to foreign policy. Certainly he talks about it in a very different way from the typical hardline imperialist perspective of really most members of both the Democratic and Republican parties in the United States. And at times in his actions as a member of Congress, that perspective has been reflected. Now, it can likewise be said that Tulsi Gabbard's perspective on U.S. foreign policy sets her apart from those of most Democrats. Tulsi was asked by an interviewer from NPR which U.S. wars she thought were justified. And she said it was hard to think of any since World War II that you could be justified. Unfortunately, there are very few examples of this justified use of military force. I think it's very telling that the last time Congress officially declared war was World War II. And in this interview, she talked about the cost of war. And the author of this article said when she talks about wars being costly, she's referring to both the human and the fiscal cost. Let's see, I think I had something. Oh, yeah, here we go. I think this is from her campaign website, maybe? I'm not sure. But I'm not sure if it was a speech or an interview, she said the cost of war extends to every single one of us. Since 9/11, we have spent over $6 trillion on waging these wasteful regime change wars for years and years. Wars that have cost us American lives, taxpayer dollars, and that have caused pain, death, and destruction to other countries and have made us less safe. Think about how many lives we could have saved and how many taxpayer dollars we can save. So I should note here that she's often been accused of not talking about the effects of U.S. foreign policy on other countries, and that's just a false accusation. She talks about that quite a bit, really. Um, so, she's well known for her opposition to regime change wars, and she gets criticized for overusing that term for some reason. And those whose objective is to smear her even claim that this is a Russian term, which seems a little odd to say that regime change wars is a Russian term. It's obviously an English language phrase, um, and one that dates back to American media in the early 20th century. I believe there was an article in the Los Angeles Times, I don't have it called up here, back in 1925 that, according to Wikipedia anyway, was the first use of this term. Um, and, it's used often by opponents of U.S. foreign policy or those who question it. Anyway, so like Bernie, Tulsi has spoken out against U.S. Covert regime change operations dating back many decades, such as the overthrow of the elected government of Iran in 1953. She says here, the history of the United States' relationship with Iran is rooted in and defined by a decades-long policy of regime change, which began with the CIA-led overthrow of democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953 in order to keep U.S.-backed Mohammad Reza Shah in power. This ultimately sparked the 1979 Islamic Revolution, which grew from strong opposition to years of U.S. interventionist policies in Iran and throughout the region. As Iran's new anti-U.S. government took power, our threats of intervention grew, and Iran started its nuclear program as a direct response to defending against the possibility of another U.S.-led intervention and regime change plot. And she pointed out, this government was democratically elected, and she's pointed out other democratically elected governments that the U.S. has overthrown. Let's see. So, for example, recently she said, what happened in Bolivia is a coup, period. The United States and other countries should not be interfering in the Bolivian people's pursuit of self-determination and right to choose their own government. Oh, what a surprise. Twitter took away my like on this tweet. Tulsi also points out the vested interests behind U.S. policy, such as the military-industrial complex or the colossal amounts of oil present in many of the countries where the U.S. intervenes. So, with regard to U.S. intervention in Venezuela, Tulsi said, it's about the oil again. Bolton just exposed the real motive for intervention in Venezuela. We're in conversation with major American companies now, Bolton said. It would make a difference if we could have American companies produce the oil in Venezuela. We both have a lot at stake here. And she's also pointed out that Trump has U.S. troops illegally occupying the oil fields in Syria, and that Trump actually admitted that they were going to steal Syria's oil. I hope I said Syria a minute ago. That's where I meant. She speaks often about the high human as well as financial cost of war, both here and in the countries where those wars are waged. She speaks highly of Brown University scholar Stephen Kinzer's book, Overthrow, which discusses a history of U.S. regime change efforts dating all the way back to the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy and colonizing of Hawaii by the U.S. in 1893. Recently, she and Stephen Kinzer and former Congressman Dennis Kucinich held a joint event to discuss the situation in Iran and U.S. foreign policy generally. So, rhetorically, both Bernie and Tulsi have expressed strong sentiments opposing U.S. warmongering and interventionism, generally speaking. However, uh, that's not to say that there aren't shortcomings in their views and records, foreign policy-wise, especially Bernie's, I would have to say, but Tulsi's not perfect either, from my perspective. So let's take a closer look. So Bernie was elected to Congress in 1990 and began serving in January 1991. So he has a nearly 30-year record on foreign policy. And as he mentioned in the interview that I quoted to you from, he opposed both the first and second Iraq wars. He's opposed the war in Yemen, and he opposes the Trump administration's effort at regime change in Iran and Venezuela. But let's look at what else he's done during that 29-year tenure in Congress. Okay, so this article is from Left Voice, a obviously leftist publication that in this article is the author is very critical of Bernie Sanders' foreign policy. So you can see right there from the title, not on our side on Bernie Sanders and imperialism. So he says, Bernie Sanders presents himself as an anti-war candidate, but he has voted in favor of almost every single U.S. military intervention in the last 2 decades. Not quite true, but he's voted for a great many of them, as we'll see here. So he says, when it comes to American imperialism and war, Sanders may offer slightly different rhetoric than other Democratic candidates or Donald Trump, but his record proves him to be no alternative at all, or at least not a satisfactory alternative. And I commented here, maybe that's a bit harsh. He has opposed the wars in Iran and Yemen, spoke out against the coup in Bolivia, and the shenanigans in Brazil that put Lula in prison on what appear to be false charges of corruption. And he's opposed regime change efforts in Venezuela and Iran. So he mentions the interview with the New York Times that I just quoted to you from. And says, he stated that he did his best to stop American foreign policy. And the author says Sanders' opposition to U.S.-backed death squads in Central America is to be welcomed. But did he do his best? During the 1980s, Vermont was one of the largest recipients of Defense Department weapons contracts, such as the General Electric plant in Burlington, which produced Gatling guns for death squads. When peace activists planned to block the gate to the GE factory in 1983, Sanders refused to support them and had them arrested. Sanders, according to one Vermont journalist, viewed his key constituencies as the unions and poor. Bread and butter economics framed his analysis, pushing long-term issues such as peace conversion to the margins of society. Even during his, quote, radical period, Sanders was only opposed to militarism if it didn't affect the jobs of American workers. So in 1991, Sanders came into Congress, into the House of Representatives, as a nominal independent. He worked very closely with the Democratic Party right from the very beginning of his tenure in Congress. Anyway, at that time, there appeared to be some justification for calling him anti-war, since he voted against the annual Pentagon budgets for war and against authorizing the first Gulf War of 1991. Yet, his opposition to war was inconsistent. In 1998, Sanders voted for the Iraq Liberation Act and another resolution that supported American measures to overthrow Saddam Hussein. As Jeffrey St. Clair noted for Counterpunch, these measures gave congressional backing for the CIA's covert plan to overthrow the Hussein regime in Baghdad. The U.S. plan wasn't so covert if you read about this resolution or reports about it. But anyway, the things that Bernie voted for also tightened the economic sanctions on Iraq, and there's a famous exchange between Clinton's Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and a reporter from somewhere where she is asked, there are reports that 500,000 Iraqi children, and who knows how many non-children, have died as a result of the harsh economic sanctions against Iraq. And asks, do you think that horrible cost is worth it? And she said, we think the price is worth it. Well, I mean, Bernie voted for these sanctions, so I guess he had the same view. The resolution that is referred to here, if you want to check it out, you can click on the link in the article. It also gave the green light to Operation Desert Fox, a 4-day-long bombing campaign striking 100 targets throughout Iraq. The operation featured more than 300 bombing sorties and 350 ground-launched Tomahawk cruise missiles, several targeting Saddam Hussein himself. Also, in 1996, Bernie voted in favor of the Iran and Libya Sanctions Act, which imposes sanctions on persons exporting certain goods or technology that would enhance Iran's ability to explore for, extract, refine, or transport by pipeline petroleum resources. So, basically, sanctions aiming to hurt Iran and Libya's oil industries. In 1998, he voted in favor of extraditing black revolutionary Assata Shakur to the United States from Cuba in order to face, quote, justice. However, the most notorious action of Sanders during the Clinton years was voting in favor of the American bombing in Kosovo in 1999. When anti-war activists occupied Sanders' office in 1999 due to his support for the war, he had them arrested. There's a pattern there. He's done this a number of times. Sanders' backing for airstrikes in Kosovo led one of his advisors, Jeremy Brecker, to resign in disgust, writing, "Is there a moral limit to the military violence you are willing to participate in or support? Where does that limit lie? And when that limit has been reached, what action will you take?" He didn't get a response to his open letter to Bernie. So, as you probably are aware, in 2001, shortly after the September 11th terrorist attacks, there was a resolution authorizing use of military force that basically provided a blank check to George W. Bush to go after the terrorists responsible for 9/11 however he wanted. And all but one member of Congress, Barbara Lee, voted in favor of that resolution, and Bernie, of course, was among them. And Bernie had this reputation as a peacenik for a long time, but on a number of occasions he voted for military funding for this and that, including in 2007, the overall military budget. Another weak point in terms of Bernie's foreign policy is his views on Israel, which this author says place him well within the liberal Zionist mainstream. While rhetorically in favor of fair play to both sides, in practice he comes down on the side of Israel. While sometimes deploring Israeli excesses, he ultimately comes down in support of the apartheid regime of Israel. In a speech largely devoted to endorsing Jesse Jackson's campaign and his position on Israel, Sanders did speak out against the IDF, that's the Israeli Defense Forces, treatment of Palestinians during the First Intifada, saying it was an absolute disgrace and that the sight of Israeli soldiers breaking the arms and legs of Arabs is reprehensible. The idea of Israel closing down towns and sealing them off is unacceptable. However, despite offering some criticism of Israel, he also was critical of Palestinians and held them responsible to a significant degree for a lot of this violence. He emphasized his support for Israel as well. He said, "You need to protect the state of Israel." That's clearly and absolutely right. Sanders' support for protecting Israel was not just rhetorical, but he voted to provide billions in military hardware and aid to Israel in several years where that was voted on. When Hamas won the Palestinian elections in 2006, Sanders voted in favor of imposing sanctions on Palestine in order to remove them from power. He also voted for resolutions in favor of Israeli military actions against Lebanon in 2006 and Gaza in 2014. And there's a town hall meeting I believe in Burlington, Vermont, right after the Gaza bombing by Israel and the resolution that Bernie voted for expressing support for Israel, and really not mentioning anything about the horrible effects of that bombing. So there were some people at his town hall meeting that were kind of angry at him for how he voted. And he got very defensive and tried to deflect and talk about Hamas terrorism and so forth. And at one point, he told a member of the audience to shut up and threatened him with arrest. I'll put a link to that. There's a link here in the this article, but I'll put a separate link to it in the description of the video. It's true that Sanders has expressed opposition to the government of Benjamin Netanyahu and even refused to attend a speech by the Israeli Prime Minister in 2015, but this remains empty symbolism. He said that the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, BDS, to end the occupation of the Palestinian territories is motivated in part by anti-Semitism. So that's just horrible rhetoric that you hear from right-wing Zionists, or not even necessarily right-wing in other respects, but even liberal Zionists in the United States that equate opposition to the Israeli government's policies and support for sanctions and divestment and boycotting Israel. Equate that or characterize that as a form of anti-Semitism. So that's quite a bad take by Bernie here, I believe. During the Obama years, Sanders showed his continued support for American imperialism by voting in favor of the military budget in 2009, 2010, and 2013. He also supported, at least to an extent, I would say, not wholly, Obama's military actions against Libya. He backed sanctions against Russia. He supported, in 2014, providing $1 billion in aid to the government of Ukraine, which had come to power in a military coup where there were literal Nazis and other far-right forces very heavily involved in both the military and the government that came to power in 2014 in that U.S.-backed coup. So he's literally voting for military aid to fascists here. And he also supported weapons sales to the Saudi Arabian monarchy supposedly to fight ISIS. Let's see. He's refused to end the drone program, the author goes on to say, but promises to use it very selectively. And I know people have criticized both Bernie and Tulsi about they're saying, it's okay to keep using drones as long as we're careful about it. And really, if you're going to support using bombing or aircraft in any military capacity, I don't see that it really makes any difference whether the craft are manned or unmanned. they could still potentially cause civilian casualties. And both Tulsi and Bernie are saying, well, we should not use drones or piloted bombers in a way that runs a big risk of civilian casualties. So neither one of them are pacifists, but I wouldn't necessarily agree with the author of this article's contention that his not ending the drone program is evidence of his support for imperialism in and of itself, even though there are other ways in which he clearly does. The author here goes on to say, while he's refused to endorse the American-backed coup against President Maduro of Venezuela, he's legitimized the Trump administration's narrative that Maduro's authoritarianism and not American intervention is the problem. Furthermore, he has also called for Maduro to accept the Trojan horse of American, quote, humanitarian aid and to respect the pro-coup opposition. Let's see. Okay. Well, let's take a look at some of the things that Bernie and Tulsi have said here about Venezuela. Yeah, I don't think I have Bernie's called up. So let me have a look here. So Bernie says the Maduro government has waged a violent crackdown on Venezuelan civil society, violating the Constitution by dissolving the National Assembly, and was reelected last year in an election many observers said was fraudulent. The economy is a disaster and millions are migrating. So that's 100% bullshit. The Venezuelan government was democratically elected, and the opposition that Bernie seems to think is just democratically contesting the Maduro government, and they're being supposedly violently cracked down on. Let's be honest. These folks mainly are representative of the oligarchy, the wealthy, overwhelmingly white people in Venezuela who are very racist, such as Juan Guaido. And they have very right-wing politics. And yes, there's been violence on the part of the Venezuelan military, but it's been in response to violence by the literally fascist opposition, led, among others, by Juan Guaido. The election was observed by dozens of observers who did not say it was fraudulent at all. They said it was a very free and fair election, certainly much better than what we saw in Iowa the other day, or in general in U.S. elections. The economy is a disaster, yes, Bernie, because there are harsh U.S. economic sanctions, the price of oil dropped, and so forth. So really a horrible take there by Bernie. He says, we must condemn the use of violence against unarmed protesters and the suppression of dissent. Bullshit. He does say we shouldn't intervene there. We shouldn't be in the business of regime change or supporting coups as we have in Chile, Guatemala, Brazil, and the Dominican Republic. The U.S. has a long history of inappropriately intervening in Latin American nations. We must not go down the road again, but I will say all kinds of bad things about those governments that are the same exact things as the people who do want to intervene and overthrow them are saying. Let's see. And then gosh, where is the other quote from him? Here we go. Bernie says, the people of Venezuela are enduring a serious humanitarian crisis. The Maduro government must put the needs of its people first, allow humanitarian aid into the country, and refrain from violence against protesters. And Bernie tweeted that in response to a situation where the U.S., probably the CIA, tried to send what was supposedly humanitarian aid into Venezuela. It might very well have been a shipment of weapons for all the Venezuelan government knew, because obviously the U.S. is trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government, so they didn't know what was on that truck. So they didn't let it in, and so Bernie's claiming they're not letting in humanitarian aid, they're ignoring the needs of the people. They were letting humanitarian aid in right and left from other countries, just not the United States. And Roger Waters, one of the leaders of the band Pink Floyd, and now doing his own thing, and also a great political activist, said, Bernie, are you effing kidding me? If you buy the Trump, Bolton, Abrams, Rubio line humanitarian intervention and collude in the destruction of Venezuela, you cannot be a credible candidate for president of the USA. Or maybe you can. Maybe you're the perfect stooge for the 1%. So, what does Tulsi say about Venezuela? Let's see. The United States needs to stay out of Venezuela. Let the Venezuelan people determine their future. We don't want other countries to choose our leaders, so we have to stop trying to choose theirs. Just simple, straightforward. You stay the hell out of Venezuela. It's their country. Let them determine their own future. Leave them alone. She's, I don't have a quote for you, but she's on a number of occasions expressed opposition to sanctions against Venezuela and pointed out how horrible the effects have been. So going back to this article, I think maybe he was a little harsh on Bernie in his overall conclusion, because Bernie has opposed the wars in Iraq and Yemen and spoken out against the coup in Bolivia and various other coups of the U.S. over the years. He's opposed regime change efforts in Venezuela and Iran. But he's supported a number of military interventions. And certainly his stance against U.S. intervention, when he does stand against it, often includes this rhetoric, saying, well, this government is really bad, but we shouldn't intervene. And Tulsi really never does that I've heard. So that's a big distinction between them. Okay, so let's move on to talking in a bit of detail about Tulsi Gabbard's foreign policy. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to pause this video because I do need to check on my laundry here.